Hello, this is going to be a slightly rambly video, so feel free to click off if you don't like rambly videos. I'm sure somebody will complain anyway, but hopefully that will reduce the numbers. Um, let's imagine to start off with that one man pronounces this word think and another man pronounces it fink. Which man is pronouncing it correctly? Which is the way, in other words, that you should pronounce this word? Well, I think if you've watched these videos for a long time, you'll probably know what my perspective on this is going to be. I think that if you remove all the humanity from it, if you were an alien coming down from space and studying human language, it would be ridiculous to propose that one person is speaking correctly and the other person is speaking wrong. It would be me. It would be like me listening to two mouse vocalizations, which are slightly different frequencies, and saying that the higher pitched mouse is speaking wrong. How do I know? There's no way of measuring that. You know, I can't ask the mouse. So intrinsically, the universe has no opinion on anything, let alone does it have an opinion on whether think is right and think is wrong. Humans, on the other hand, humans that speak English, may well have a strong opinion on which one of these is right and which one is wrong. They're likely to think that think is right and that think is wrong. Many people don't care, you know. The think pronunciation is becoming a lot more popular in Britain nowadays, and it's becoming, I think, probably less stigmatized than it used to be. But it is still fairly stigmatized, and there are still people who get quite annoyed by it. But all of the reasons they're annoyed by it are socially constructed or based on socially constructed things. They may be annoyed by it because their teachers at school told them that you should say think. They may even have started off saying think themselves and have been corrected by their teachers. And when you're a child and somebody who seems to be an authority on the English language tells you to say things a certain way, you tend to uncritically take those ways of thinking about it into your adulthood. Well, you know, when you're a kid and an English teacher tells you to say something a particular way, that's the way you should say it. Obviously, the English teacher knows the correct way of saying it. And then by the time you're an adult, you may not even remember that you think that because it was your English teacher or because your parents told you. You may just know that it's right to say think and wrong to say think. Well, your parents only think that it's right to say think because their parents or their English teacher told them it, and your English teacher only thinks it for the same reason. This is just a kind of perpetual cycle. So where does the idea actually come from that one of these pronunciations is better? Well, in this case, I think it's probably, the evidence becomes kind of fuzzy when you go back more than a few decades, but I think it's probably rooted in the fact that think started off as a working class pronunciation in London. In the late 1800s, Cockney speakers, working class Londoners, said th in certain contexts where everybody else would say th. And so it started off as a sort of class stigmatized thing. Was there any reason for the class stigmatization? Well, I think just classism. Sound change happens in all languages, all dialects, all the time. And so it's going to happen in certain class-based sociolects. An arbitrary sound change of th turning into f in certain situations happens in a sociolect that happens to be considered working class. And then that's just another reason for the upper classes to beat them with a stick and say, you're pronouncing things wrong, you don't know how to speak English, you're uneducated. And I do think, you know, I don't think that when an English teacher tells you to say think rather than think, they're necessarily thinking that person sounds like a commoner. You know, I don't think that that's the thought process in their brain, but I think that's probably what it stems back to historically. Ultimately, sound changes, as I say, happen in all dialects. They're pretty much arbitrary, and everyone can still understand you if you pronounce this word as think. And if they claim not to be able to understand you, I would suggest that's a problem with their comprehension and not a problem with your speech. where am I going with all this? Well, the attitude that you should pronounce things one way rather than another is a prescriptive attitude. Prescriptivism is a framework in which there are ways that you should do things and say things, and ways in which you shouldn't do things and say things. This framework is everywhere in human society. It exists in language, it exists in behaviour, in moral behaviour, or ideas about how you should behave morally. And often these are taken by people almost to be kind of objective normative standards, without much critical assessment of, well, actually there are just a load of social reasons why I think this is right and I think this is wrong. Many linguists have prescriptive ideas about language, but at least in Britain, in my experience, the kinds of prescriptive ideas that linguists have about language tend to be different from the kinds that other people have about language. Linguists are likely to be aware of the arbitrary nature of a lot of linguistic differences, and so they're more likely to be able to spot prescriptive attitudes that are rooted in classism or rooted in racism or misogyny. But they may still hold prescriptive attitudes like, for example, you shouldn't go around saying racial slurs, or you shouldn't go around using misogynistic language. These things are prescriptive attitudes about how you should speak, but I would say most of the linguists I know probably accept those as their own moral opinions. The academic study of linguistics, on the other hand, is inherently descriptive. And that means that rather than telling people how they should speak and how they should behave, you're trying to study how they actually do speak and how they actually do behave. And I think most modern linguists, I don't think it's controversial to say, would agree that linguistics is an inherently descriptive field, and that prescriptivism may be an interesting, thing that you can study. Why are people prescriptive? How does prescriptive behaviour work? But it's not something you should use as a tool in your research. You shouldn't go into studying someone's dialect or language with a load of normative ideas about how they should be speaking, as part of your repertoire of research tools. Now, you may go in with a descriptive attitude, study some linguistic phenomenon, come out, and then use it in a prescriptive way. If you don't think, as I don't think, that racial slurs should be thrown around in polite discourse, you could study from an objective descriptivist angle how racial slurs are used, who uses them, why are they used in certain situations, and then you may take that data and try to reduce the use of those words using that data in a prescriptive way. But the point is that when you're being scientific, you have to kind of rid yourself of anything that's subjective and socially constructed just while you're doing the research. And normative statements about how people should speak are socially constructed, and so they will interfere with any research that you're doing. The same thing is true within anthropology. I don't know if the words descriptive and prescriptive are as commonly used in anthropology, but this applies to moral attitudes to behaviour. So to copy and slightly alter my example from the start, let's imagine that you meet one person who's very against human sacrifice and thinks it's evil and ridiculous, and then somebody from another culture who thinks that human sacrifice is necessary. The one guy feels very strongly that it's bad, and the other guy feels very strongly that it's good. And I would guess that probably most of my audience here side with one of the guys rather than the other. But ultimately, when you look out into the universe, it doesn't have an answer for which one of them is right and which one of them is wrong. You may feel really strongly that one of them is right and the other is wrong, but at the end of the day, it is one human's word against another's. And I think the way that it's important primarily to use this in anthropology is the same as in linguistics. If you're trying to understand why certain cultures have certain cultural practices and certain cultural beliefs, you have to try to deconstruct your own beliefs and step away from them as much as possible before you start trying to climb into the other cultures. It's impossible to completely shed yourself of your own biases, but you can at least be aware of what they are so that you can put them to one side while you're studying the other culture. The more you're able to deconstruct your own beliefs and your own morals and your own ideas about common sense, the better you will be able to study the other cultures. So I think that's where it's necessary in researching things as an anthropologist. But I think a natural side effect of that is that you may start to, you may have a bit of a, not necessarily a crisis, but a big think about your own ideas of morality. You may kind of start to question, well, am I right about any of my moral opinions? If it's possible to just step back, if the objective way of looking at it is that I'm just a person with opinions, then is there any meaning in my moral opinions? Is there even any point in having them? And I would say that ultimately, you are a human functioning in a society. You don't have to be an anthropologist all the time. Moral opinions can be rationally kind of reasoned through. It doesn't make them externally objective, I don't think. But if everybody agrees we want to reduce human suffering, we want to reduce harm within our society, how do we do that? There can then be debates around the best ways of doing that. People can have different opinions about what laws and what moral behaviours are the best for avoiding suffering. So I think you can rationalise and reason about these things once you've come up with a common kind of a more objective common aim that you can work towards. So yeah, I don't think being an anthropologist means you can't have your own moral point of view. You can even look at something somebody in another culture is doing and think that it's reprehensible. But I think it can be really damaging to research if you work from a basis that people are stupid, that people are primitive, that people are immoral, that people haven't worked out how to behave properly yet. These things are all ethnocentric and not how things tend to be done in modern anthropology. This is difficult on another level as well, because as much as it may be intuitive to me that there's no universally intrinsically right way of behaving and no intrinsically right way of speaking, that's quite a secular point of view. If you're a Christian, you may well believe that there's an inherently right way of behaving and that comes from God. This is, I think, something that I've struggled with in modern anthropology, is how much can it be an empiricist science if one of the first things you notice as an anthropologist is that other cultures don't necessarily think about things in the same empiricist way I do. If other cultures believe in an intrinsic inherent morality, how do I square that with my opinion that there isn't one? The views that it takes and the way of thinking that it takes to be an anthropologist in modern Britain could well be, and in fact I think does run counter to the way a lot of, perhaps even most human societies view things, that there is a normative way of doing things and there is a right way of doing this and doing that and thinking about this and thinking about that. That's a struggle that I have not quite worked my way out of. I'm still not sure where I stand on things like that. How empiricist can you be as an anthropologist and still properly understand another culture's way of thinking? How can I go about anthropology basing my behaviour on the idea that there's no intrinsic right and wrong. If, you know, somebody in a culture that I'm interested in may believe very strongly that there are objective right and wrong behaviours, or my friend down the street who happens to be a Muslim believes that there's an intrinsic right and wrong, that it comes from God. That's something I still haven't quite worked out. There's probably reams of literature on it that I've just missed because I don't know the right keywords to search for. But yeah, I know that was a bit rambly and disjointed, but I think I've said something useful, and I promise to come to you next time with a more structured thing. I did have it mostly edited now, but I realised it was getting a little bit late for me to be uploading. You know, I didn't want to leave it another 5 days or whatever. But yeah, I'll see you soon, and thank you very much for listening.